actually start talking about entrepreneurship. So I'm Haseeb. It's great to meet you all. I'm a crypto VC, so I'm not a professor. Usually when I talk to audiences of people, I'm very used to, well, because I'm not a professor and I'm not an academic, when you're a professor, you don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to explain to anybody, well, here's who I am, here's why you should listen to me, here's why I'm a big deal. You're all here, you showed up and you're just listening. But I'm not a professor, so I don't get that privilege. And obviously Don's reputation speaks for itself, mine doesn't. So I'll tell you a bit about my background. So I used to be a professional poker player when I was very young. I was later a software engineer. I worked at Airbnb and at earn.com, which got acquired by Coinbase. I was a startup founder in crypto, and I've been an investor for over 5 years. I now work at a firm called Dragonfly, which is one of the largest crypto venture funds in the world. We manage several $billion investing purely into crypto projects, Web3 projects, whatever you want to call them. So I want to get a quick read of the room, and I know, and just for everyone else to be aware, there are a lot of people taking this course online as well, and I want to make sure they also feel some participation, but I want to get a read of the room. So the first question I have for you guys is, how many of you feel like you know quite a lot about crypto/Web3? Okay, I see somebody with a Polygon shirt and somebody was showing an Aave fan. So nobody's raising their hand. I don't believe you guys. How many of you feel like, okay, I know more than the average bear among my friends, my peer group about crypto? Like, I'm the crypto person. Okay, I'm getting about half. So it seems like about half people don't feel that way. How many of you are on the EECS side? Okay, how many of you are from the business school side? Okay, how many of you are neither? Or from something else? Okay, interesting. A few hands. Okay, so we have majority are engineering, a few people are business, and then a couple stragglers, I don't know how they ended up here, are doing something else entirely. That's great. Well, I'm going to try to make this course valuable to anybody with any different level of background, but I also want to make this course as participatory as possible. So startups are a really personal thing. We're not going to be studying startups. We're going to be talking about how to build one. We're going to be talking about what you might do with your life, with your career, which is very different than anything else you're going to be spending time on in your classes. Okay, so I want you to feel free to ask questions, or to challenge me, or to just say like, hey, I think what you're saying is stupid, and here's why. Please raise your hand. I will stop and I will call on you. I don't have enough slides to get through the whole hour without that, so I'm counting on you guys to pipe in at some point. So, and the same thing for people who are online, although I may not be able to stop with as much regularity for people who are online. Okay, we're going to talk about startups. Now, everybody knows what a startup is. I'm not going to explain what a startup is, but one thing you might not know if you haven't worked at a startup or worked for a startup is how startups are different from regular companies. Okay, startups are special. Startups have magic powers. This is because startups are small. So most startups, especially in the very early days, they're maybe 3, 4, 6, 7 people, very, very small groups of people, right? So this is like a single scouting group against an army. That's what a big company is like. Whereas a startup is more like some Navy SEALs. They can go in and do crazy things that very few other people can do because they're so small. They're nimble. They can move fast. They can change on a dime. Only a small number of people need to come together and make the decision that, hey, let's go do this other thing. There's a big company. It takes months. There's planning. There's meetings. There's all this nonsense. They're also unconstrained, meaning that they have no sacred cows. If you're a startup and you realize you did the wrong thing, you can just go do the right thing. Whereas if you're a big company and you did the wrong thing, it's like, well, we made this big product announcement, and we have partners, and we did this thing, so maybe we should wait a couple quarters, and then we'll sunset it, and then we'll do this other thing. Big companies are very constrained in what they can do and how they can do it. Startups are courageous. Startups take risks. Big companies got big because they found something that worked, and they probably don't want to change that thing. So it's very difficult for big companies to take big risks. That's why when you see a big company do something really risky, everyone's like, oh my God, can you believe that Facebook tried to launch a stablecoin? That's crazy. Everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe Facebook did that. But if a startup launches a stablecoin, okay, well, of course, a startup's going to launch a stablecoin, right? Because startups can take risks that big companies find much harder to do the same. And lastly, startups are innovative. Startups, because they are a small group of people who are starting with a blank slate, they can come up with something completely new. Doesn't matter if it affects traditional business model, doesn't matter if people think it's weird, doesn't matter if the target market is so small, they can innovate, they can change things, they can make something completely brand new. Startups can do amazing things, but they're also very fragile, okay? A big company is like an elephant, right? It's gigantic, it lumbers around, it's very slow to move, it's very habitual, and it can very easily crush small companies underneath it. But startups, yes, they're small, yes, they very easily can get destroyed by the whim of a large company, but startups can do a lot of things that big companies can't do. So in a big company, just to make some comparisons between big companies and startups, in a big company, responsibility is diffuse, meaning that you've got lots of managers, lots of people who are working on different projects, and nobody feels like, okay, it's my responsibility to make sure that revenue is high this quarter, right? Everyone has like this tiny little corner of the product that they're responsible for. Whereas in a startup, everybody feels responsible. A startup is like one of those little rowboats where if water is going in the rowboat, everybody's like, oh my God, we got to get the rowboat back up and, get the water out of here. Whereas if you're in, a yacht and it springs a leak, you're like, there's somebody for that. I'm sure there's somebody whose job it is to fix that leak. In a big company, you must defend your cash cows. So there's a core business, you got to defend the core business. In a startup, you put everything on the line. The whole point of a startup is to go take a big risk. Go take a swing to build something huge. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but that's the name of the game. In a big company, you make lots of incremental improvements, right? If you're a big company, by definition, you have a working product that made you big. And so your goal is not to like reinvent the wheel. It's not to make some brand new big splash every year. It's just to keep making a little bit of progress, right? Everything is incremental progress. Whereas in a startup, if you do not innovate, you will die. There is no incremental gain that can make a startup successful. Startups have to be paradigm changing in the way that they build their products or the way that they launch their products. Best companies are best managed. So management is very important in traditional companies, right? And that's why there's a lot of, those of you who are in the business school side, probably you've been taught a lot about management. Management doesn't matter in startups. It's not that it doesn't matter. Eventually it matters when a startup scales to a certain size. But in the very beginning, which is the critical period for a startup, management doesn't really matter. Generally speaking, when you have less than like 7 or 8 people in a team, everyone knows what everyone else is thinking, right? It's like a family. Everybody is already tuned in. Your family doesn't need middle management, right? Your mom and dad just kind of be like, okay, we're going here, and the kids just get it. And you just go, right? That's what startups are like. And lastly, big companies are default alive, meaning that if nothing else changes, if nobody does anything great, the company will still survive and everyone will keep getting paid and everything will be fine, right? Startups, generally speaking, are default dead, meaning that if nothing happens, if nothing changes, everyone is going to lose their jobs. The startup is going to die. Startups only survive by innovating and changing, which is why the status quo at a startup is never okay. You always have to keep pushing and keep innovating. Now, startups are important because like all organisms, big companies, although they are dominant, some of the biggest companies in the world are like this, they decay over time. They become slower. They become more entrenched, right? It becomes harder to change things. There's more politics. There's more things just start gumming up the gears, right? Startups are important because startups eventually replace big companies. When there's been too much decay, too much rot in a big company, it stops becoming competitive. It starts becoming weak. It starts wasting too much money. And startups that are nimbler, that are faster, that are more innovative, eventually replace them. And this cycle has been happening throughout history. So the biggest companies in the world today, 20 years ago, they were startups. Google was a startup, Amazon was a startup, Microsoft was a startup, right? And the companies that they were replacing at that time, to them, they looked like antiquated, old, slow-moving, rotting companies. At the time, it was IBM, right? IBM was what Microsoft was going after. So what Google was going, Google was going after Yahoo as well. But for IBM, there was also somebody before them that they saw as this antiquated, decaying company. And the same thing is true today. A lot of people look at Google and they see an antiquated company. Something with a lot of spend, a lot of focus on defending the cash cow, defending search, defending these core businesses, and not enough innovation. And in fact, that's a lot of what makes Web3 and crypto so exciting to a lot of people, is because they believe that this is the way that some of the current generation of big company behemoths are going to get disrupted. And yet, startups are stressful. They are unforgiving, and they are extremely risky. Most startups fail. Okay, I want to explain this chart. This is a very, very important chart to understand. This is showing on the left side the funding round. The first round of funding is called your seed round, And every subsequent round of funding, if you raise more money, you raise more money, you raise more money, they're lettered. So Series A is the next round, Series B is the next round, and so on. Okay, so what this is saying is that your failure to raise your next round, meaning you raise a seed round, what's the chance you raise a Series A? Meaning that what's the inverse of that is the chance that you die before you ever get to your Series A. The answer is 80%. 80% of the time, if you raise a seed round successfully, 80% chance that you never raise another round of funding and your company dies and you go back in the dustbin of history. If you raise that round, there's a 50% chance that you don't raise a Series B. Then there's a 55% chance you don't raise a Series C. 62% chance you don't raise a Series C, and so on and so forth. There's a telescoping chance that you actually successfully raise a subsequent round of funding. You can see this is a brutal tournament. Most startups, even startups that successfully raise their first or their second round of funding, die. And the third column here is failure to exit. Meaning that, okay, maybe you don't raise a subsequent round of funding, but you do either get acquired or you IPO. This obviously happens. 97% of the time, you raise a seed round, there's no exit. An exit means that you cashed out. There's no cash out for 97% of companies that raise a seed round. For Series A, 88% of them never cash out. For Series B, 84% of them never cash out. Series C, 80% of them never cash out. Meaning that these people walk away with basically nothing. They walk away with great experiences. Maybe they go to some big company that acquires them. Maybe it's great. Maybe they have some great stories to tell. They build a great network. But ultimately, they don't get rich. Very few people who build startups get rich. Most people should not start startups. If you start a startup, it's important to internalize this. If you start a startup, you will probably fail. And you will almost certainly not become rich. Okay? And yet, you guys might notice that there's a lot of stuff out there trying to tell you you should start a startup. There's a lot of people marketing to people like you, very bright students, I assume, I don't know, I haven't met you guys, that you should start a startup and that startups are wonderful and amazing and they're very high status and they're very cool and everybody who's really worth their salt and kind of, enough of a risk taker in life, they're going to start a startup, so you should too, right? You guys know exactly what I'm talking about, especially here at Berkeley. Starting a startup is basically the coolest thing you can do, short of dropping out. Dropping out is like number one, then start a startup, then it's like, get a PhD, I don't know, just work at Google, I don't know what's cool these days, but startups won't make you cool, okay? Startups won't make you rich. They'll challenge you, they'll stress you out, and they will take away years of your life. I hope I've scared you, because it's important to be scared of startups, because a lot of people come out of school thinking that startups are awesome, thinking that startups are like this big field trip where you get to rent an office and put your name on there and get to come up with your crazy product, and it's going to be a great a montage of you and your friends having fun. Right? I think that's what we've managed, this cultural vision of what a startup is. We've managed to sell this to a generation of young people like yourselves. And I know that many of you, deep in your heart of hearts, feel that, yeah, maybe a seed startup wouldn't be successful, but mine would, because I'm so awesome. You should be scared of starting a startup. There's only one good reason to start a startup, and that is because you want to solve a big problem with your life, and you're willing to sacrifice time and energy for a small chance at it. That is the only reason to start a startup. Did someone raise their hand? I thought I saw a hand movement. Maybe not. Okay. So if you are taking this course, you do not have to start a startup. Okay, we're gonna treat this course as though you are starting a startup. You will form groups, you will come up with ideas, you will practice pitching, you will do all these things as though you're going to start a startup. But I want you to know it's okay if you don't start a startup. Most of you will not start startups. And those of you who will, the majority of you who will experience excruciating pain when you do start a startup. Now, if you believe that that's worth it, then you're probably the person who should start a startup. But most of you are not, and that is okay. I want you to know that's okay with me, it's okay with Don, it's okay with your peers. We're going to think no less of you, whether or not you do start a startup. And this course may still be useful to you someday, if and when you are ready to actually go and start a startup. But starting a startup is a very deeply personal journey. It's a gigantic risk to take with your life. It takes out a lot of your energy, your time, and your mental health. But for some people, it makes a world of difference. Okay, so why are startups so valuable? It can't have escaped your attention that people who start startups seem to be incredibly rich. Despite everything I've told you about how high the failure rates are, clearly there are some startups that are extremely valuable. why are startups so valuable? By the way, are we getting any questions online?
One question is, do crypto startups have any significant difference compared to startups in other fields? And then also, what's the difference between Web3 startups versus Web2 startups?
Okay, great. So I will actually, so the question was, there was a question coming in online, what's the difference between Web3/crypto startups and regular startups? I will be addressing that specifically later in the lecture, so hang tight and I'll get to that. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think those are all.
Great. Okay. Any questions from the room? Yes. I did. Okay. Sorry. So the question was, I showed that there are some pretty bad success rates for most startups. Do my startups have the same? Well, I'm really struggling to navigate to the slide. Here we go. Nope, wrong one. Sorry. You just have to play this animation. The question was, are the success rates of the startups that we invest in the same as these? The answer is no. They're better, but they're not dramatically better. So I would say one, in Web3, because of the surfeit of funding, there's a lot of funding available for Web3 startups. They find it easier to raise rounds of funding. Also, Web3 startups are not as capital intensive. I mean, they don't require as much money to build. So the average startup, a lot of them are building hardware, they're building, consumer goods, and they require a lot of upfront investment of money because you have to go to a factory, you have to build something that's physical. Software startups tend to be much more capital efficient. So because of that, almost everything in Web3, it's a lot easier to fund it. And because of the excitement around Web3, they've had a lot easier time getting funding. So in terms of the failure to raise following rounds of funding, it's better for Web3 startups than it is for traditional startups. I don't know the exact number, but it's certainly better than these numbers. The better of an investor you are, generally speaking, the better these numbers will look for your cohort of investments. So this is looking at the average across all potential startups. But if you're looking at, for example, Sequoia, which is one of the best known venture funds in the world, their investments have a much better than the average chance of raising a subsequent round of funding because of the selection effect. Great question. Any other questions? Yes.
So those assuming the startups come from universities like Berkeley, Stanford, and being those statistics would be better, or?
Yeah. So the question is, if they come from an Ivy League school, are the statistics going to be better than these? Almost certainly, because of course this is looking in aggregate at all startups that were, I believe it came from Crunchbase numbers. So Crunchbase is just a database of a bunch of every startup that has entered data into Crunchbase. So there's definitely going to be positive selection effect if you select a cohort that's better. Now it's not going to be dramatically better. So Berkeley, Stanford, MIT, whatever type schools are good, but they are not 5 times better than the average startup. They're maybe 2 times better than the average startup, probably not 5 times better. Any other questions? Yes.
How would you define a startup? Because the latest for companies like SpaceX and ByteDance, very large companies, why are they still considered startups?
So these are, so it's a good question. So the question is, I have this slide that says highest value startup in the world. Question is, why are ByteDance and SpaceX counted as startups? This is using the word startup loosely. Really, this just means a non-public company. So these are companies that haven't IPO'd, so they're private companies. Not really startups, but obviously every company that's valuable today at some point was a startup, which became valuable. So the point stands that startups become valuable. And they can become valuable quite quickly. These companies are not super old, right? Most of them have been created in the last 10 years. Yes, another question.
Why finance not because finance has some risk in company stock.
Are you asking about Binance? So the question is, why is Binance not here? So Binance is not publicly listed. So BNB token is listed, but Binance itself, its equity is not listed anywhere. You could put BNB token here, but it's not exactly the same thing as the company. So I think if Binance, the company, were listed here, it might be more than yes, most likely. It would likely be worth more than 40 billion if Binance were publicly listed. Another question. Would you call a mom and pop brick and mortar business a startup? You generally would not, although it's kind of a language thing. Generally speaking, startups are intended to be scalable businesses that try to grow big and try to raise venture capital. Not all companies need venture capital. And this is something we'll talk about later when we talk about pitching and raising money. There are some companies that never raise money from venture capital. Some companies only raise debt. They never sell any equity at all. So we'll talk about these concepts, but generally speaking, if you're a mom and pop store, you're usually going to be financing yourself with debt, not with equity, meaning that you're not selling any equity to outside investors. You're just going to the bank, you're getting a loan, and you're using that to start your business, which is very different than what a startup would do. Startups generally can't get loans because there's no revenue to borrow against. Any other questions? Yes.
How do you define success?
So the question is, how do you measure success for a startup? So we'll be talking about that in a bit more detail, but for the case of the exit percentages that I was showing in the chart, that's showing either acquisition or IPO. Those are basically the two instances in which a founder can turn their shares into dollars, right? Because at the end of the day, if you just have shares, after 10 years, 15 years, it's like, okay, well, I still haven't made money. When do I actually get rich? You don't get rich with shares, you get rich with cash. And the only way to turn your stock into cash is either one, you get acquired by another company that is public, or two, you go public yourself. Now, the third option is that you launch a token, and we'll talk more about that in crypto. But generally speaking, that's what we mean by an exit. So now it's not the only measure of success, but for startups, we'll be using that as a proxy for success. Yes.
So when you say failure to exit, in terms of like without trying to be a failure to exit.
Correct. ByteDance would qualify as a failure to exit currently because it hasn't exited yet. Yes, another question.
You mentioned that big companies in the NDK, but in the past years we've seen big companies acquiring a bunch of startups. This is the way to survive, and it's coming back this like area. And if it's not, do you think it's the right way for these big companies to keep surviving, or what do you think?
So the question is, so I mentioned that big companies tend to decay. So the strategy of a lot of big companies to acquire lots of smaller startups, more nimble startups, is that a way to kind of stave off this process of decay? It's a couple of things. So one, yes, the answer is there's a little bit of like trying to drink at the fountain of youth. Like if you acquire enough startups, they'll bring the innovativeness, because your most innovative people, if you're at a big company, they'll tend to leave. They work there for a couple of years, they get kind of bored, they leave, they go start something new, and then you acquire their technology back in, and then integrate it into your product again, right? And we'll talk a little bit about some of the acquisitions actually. One of the things that the very next slide talks about how not all innovation comes from startups, but a lot of innovation does come from startups. Because in many ways, it's quite difficult to innovate within large companies, especially when large companies are not really incentivized around innovation, especially when they're not around the core product. So if you're around the core product, then innovation is basically the name of the game, right? You need to keep improving the core product. But innovation that's kind of far flung, you'll see some of the most memorable products that you know of were actually smaller companies that were acquired. So YouTube was a small company that was acquired by Google. Google Maps was also a company that was acquired by Google. DoubleClick, which basically today one of the most valuable acquisitions ever done, most likely, is actually the engine behind Google's ad auctions. That was acquired, and it's now an integral part of how Google makes almost all their money. Android was acquired, Instagram was acquired, PayPal was acquired. All of these were startups that were acquired by larger companies that weren't able to build this stuff in-house, but were able to absorb the innovation from a startup internally. And that's why M&A or acquisitions, M&A stands for mergers and acquisitions. That's why acquisitions are so important to the life cycle of how startups end up monetizing their innovation. A lot of times the reason why their innovation is valuable is that it's valuable to a larger company that has the platform and the distribution to take advantage of that innovation. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna move on. All right, so I want to paint a big picture for you guys, because I think it's also useful to get a macro sense of why startups are so rewarding. Because you might think, like, 20 years ago, when your parents were, in the heydays of their careers, I assume, they weren't as excited about starting startups as people are today, right? You might notice that, like, why are my parents talking about startups all the time? It's only my generation that seems to be talking about startups and everything, startup this, startup that. Why did things change so much? And I think there's a good answer for this, and there's a historical and macroeconomic answer for why there's so much incentive now to start a startup. So even though I've said that most startups fail and that startups are scary and they're stressful and blah, 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 it's clearly true that there's a lot of money chasing startups. Now, here's the thing to understand. Most economic growth comes from innovation. Okay, this is just a well understood fact about macroeconomics. When countries grow, they grow because they innovate. They find new ways to do things better with the resource they already have, or they acquire more natural resources, but there aren't a lot of those left. So all we got left for the most part is innovation, or having more kids, but people don't seem to want to do that. In a world of declining growth, which is happening around the world, and declining interest rates, which is happening around the world, although obviously recently they're ticking up, but like over the long arc of history, interest rates are going down. Innovation is extremely valuable because innovation is where growth comes from. And everybody is starved for growth. Okay, now this is one of the most important charts for you to burn into your brain to just understand how the world works and how money works. Okay, I wish somebody explained this chart to me before I became an investor. This is the nominal interest rate over the last 800 years. Okay, and obviously it's very difficult to measure this because for obvious reasons that 800 years ago. What you can see is that it is going down. The interest rate has been going down over time for as long as basically we've had records of interest rates. Okay. Now, what does this mean if this is correct? What is an interest rate? An interest rate is basically the amount that I will be willing to pay you if you're going to go take my money and do something with it. Okay. And what that really means is that the interest rate is basically a measure of how productively I can use money. Because if I can use money more productively than what you're willing to pay me in interest, then I'm just going to go do that instead. I'm not going to loan the money to you. I'm going to do the other thing that I can actually earn more money with it, right? So the interest rate is the opportunity cost of capital. The interest rate is telling you basically how productive can I be if I have a marginal dollar? How much productivity can I eke out of money? Another way of saying that is how many good ideas do we have compared to how much money we have? If you have a lot of good ideas and not a lot of money, then the interest rate is going to be really high. That was the case in 1400. 1400, we had very little money, and we had a lot of good ideas. A lot of people were coming up with crazy stuff that was going to make money. But there was so little capital that we just didn't have that much stuff. We didn't have enough stuff to like give to people so they could go do stuff with it, okay? Now we're in the opposite situation. We have lots of resources. We have lots of money. We have lots of stuff, but we have very few good ideas. That's what it means when the interest rate is low. It means ideas are scarce. And that is why startups have become so important. Startups have become so important because we need more good ideas. We need more ways to grow the economy. And that is what startups fundamentally do. So most of that innovation that drives economic growth comes from startups. And it comes from people like you. So there's a lot of money chasing startups. Okay? You can see this over the last 10 years. All these numbers are going up and to the right. Okay, then on the left, that shows the amount of venture dollars that are being invested. So VCs, venture capitalists who invest in the startups, this is the amount of money they're investing every year. Okay, and on the right, these are the valuation, or not the valuations rather, but the sizes of fundraising rounds. Right? It used to be in 2012, the average seed round was about $400,000. Okay, $400,000. It is now 2.5 million. Is that right? Okay, so in between. So it's about, oh no, this is the average and this is the median. I see. So the average is about 2.5 million. So the average seed round today is 2.5 million. And 10 years ago, it was $600,000. Okay, it shows you there's a lot of capital that is trying to find good ideas. And that's why it is so much more attractive at the margin to be a startup founder today than it was 10 years ago, and much more so than it was 20 years ago. That's why the rewards are big. That's why if you're successful, it can be a life-changing outcome. But of course, you probably won't be successful, okay, but that's okay. Okay, this concludes the pep talk. I hope I've fired you up a little bit. Now we're going to dive into the meat of it, and we're going to talk about Web3. Do we take breaks or no? You guys feeling good? Should we keep going? Okay, I'm going to keep going. All right. So the question was asked earlier, how are crypto startups different from normal startups? Okay. By the way, quick side note. I'm going to call it crypto. I'm not going to call it Web3. Okay. You can call it Web3 if you want. I prefer the term crypto just because it's more inclusive of a broader category of concepts. I also think Web3 is kind of propaganda, but that's fine. We're not going to talk about that. So here's the first difference between crypto startups and traditional startups. Crypto startups are subversive. Okay. You will notice there are a lot of people who don't like crypto startups. There have been a lot of lawmakers, a lot of regulators, a lot of people who have come out against crypto startups. You will not have this experience if you go start a B2B SaaS company. But if you start a crypto company, there's a very good chance you will have to think about how regulators in different jurisdictions are going to treat what you're doing. Crypto is intrinsically subversive and is an important part of what makes building a startup in crypto different than in most other verticals. Crypto is also extremely volatile. It's hard not to notice this. My guess is that you guys have probably experienced this on some level, just looking at prices or maybe owning some yourself. This makes it very difficult to build in a space where there's so much boom and bust. People get super excited about crypto and they lose interest and say it's all a scam. And then they come back the next year and say, oh, never mind, I got it wrong. It's actually great. No, it's NFTs now. No, it's this thing now. So crypto has a lot of volatility. Now, this was also true in the early internet. The early internet went through a giant bubble in the dot-com bubble in 01, and that bubble crashed and it lost massive amounts of value. Lots of people left the industry. People thought it was all a scam, that it wasn't going to be real. And eventually the internet, of course, came back and became the source of the most dominant companies in the world today. So technological change is no stranger to volatility. But of course, in crypto, it's all happening out in the open. It's not just in the stock market, it's in it's global, it's everybody participating in it at the same time. The other thing about crypto's volatility is it makes it harder to tell what is real product market fit. Okay, product market fit is an important term, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about product. But product market fit is the idea that you've built the right thing. How do you know if you've built the right thing? Well, it has product market fit, which means that it's flying off the shelf. People are using it. More and more people want it. It solved this big problem that people had. That concept is known as product market fit because it means you built the right product for the need in this market. The two fit. That's called product market fit. The other thing about crypto that's different is that most startups are open source and they're very public. Now, not all startups. Many startups have closed source. They're just traditional SaaS companies, meaning software as a service. But a lot of startups are open source. How many people don't know what open source means? Okay, I'm assuming all of you know what open source means, so I won't define that. The other thing is that a lot of people in crypto basically live in these online platforms. They live on Twitter, on Telegram, on Discord, on WeChat, and GitHub. All this stuff lives out in the open. And this means that community is everything. So again, if you're building a B2B SaaS company, you're not hanging out in Discord all day answering questions to your community. But if you're building a crypto product, there's a good chance that that's how you're going to be spending a lot of your time. This has a lot of implications about how crypto companies need to think about strategy, but we're going to talk about that in more detail later on. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second. Any questions on what I've just gone over? Also, any questions from the online side? Okay, we have some questions online. Give us a sec.
What domains is it better to get incentive money versus concept funding or other?
Okay, let me pause you there. So the first question is, how do you know that it's the right time to raise money for a startup? So we'll come to this later on in the course, but the TLDR is that you want to raise money when you are ready. If you try to raise money too early, basically investors will not be able to underwrite or be able to price or understand how to think about the thing that you're building. It's not going to be well formed enough. There's not going to be clear enough direction, right? So very often, if you want to raise money for a startup, what investors are looking for is that you are ready to start building. If you're not ready to start building, it's probably too early. And so there are a bunch of other components about that, about having fundraising materials, maybe quitting your job, dropping out of school, blah, blah, blah. There are all these different parameters depending on your life situation. But generally speaking, the high level thing is, are you ready? If you're not ready, if you don't feel like you're ready, if people don't look at you like you're ready, you're probably not ready to raise money. And the second question was, how do you think about which companies are better for raising debt versus raising equity? So this is a bit out of the realm of startups because almost all startups raise equity. Very, very few startups will ever raise debt. Really only extremely capital intensive startups will ever raise debt, or they'll be public companies at the time that they'll raise debt, or very mature companies. So raising debt generally means that instead of raising equity, so in order to explain this, I need to explain the difference between debt and equity, which I assume not everybody understands. But the very high level, and we'll talk about this more in a later lecture, the very high level is that unless you have consistent and easy to underwrite cash flows, it's very hard to underwrite debt for a startup because most startups will not exist in 2 years' time. And if your customer is not going to exist in 2 years' time, it's very hard to make them a loan because they're probably going to die, right? They're probably not going to exist anymore. And they have very little collateral that can be seized in the case that, or can be, liquidated in the case that they default on their debt. So if you're a startup, what are your actual assets? What do you actually have? Let's say I'm a bank and I want to give a loan to a startup. Okay, and the startup says, I'm going to build this really great thing. Give me $2 million and I'll pay you back, $200,000 a year for 10 years plus interest. Right? I was like, okay, so I have to underwrite you for 10 years. Well, most startups don't make it 10 years. So that right out of the gate, that's a non-starter. Second, how are you going to pay me that $200,000 a year? Like you don't have any revenue, right? So you're constantly burning a hole in your pocket. That's two, right? Now you have to be paying out that money over time. Third is that let's say that you go under. Okay, if as a company you go under, how can I take what's left in your startup and sell the assets to make back my principal? Well, I can't do that, right? All you have is like, office chairs and a WeWork lease, right? You don't have anything worth anything. So when everyone quits, when everyone leaves, it's done. The thing is worthless, except for the money that's still in the bank, if there's any money left in the bank. Now, a traditional company, so let's say you start a pizza shop. Okay, you start a pizza shop, you go lease a, place in downtown Berkeley, right? And you say, great, I got some pizza ovens, I got some nice decor, I got this thing, blah, blah, blah. I need a loan. I plan to do this in order to like charge enough to make my pizza shop work. A bank will be like, okay, that sounds like a reasonable shot at a business. Here's a loan, pay it back to us over 6 years. And then you start your pizza shop, right? You make money, you pay back the loan with the income that you're making. It all makes sense, right? There's cash flows. If you default on the loan, then the bank can go and say, okay, great, we're going to take your pizza shop. We're going to take your pizza ovens. We're going to take all the chairs and we're going to sell them to somebody else who will at least make us some of the money back. Right? That makes a traditional company, that's a brick and mortar company, very different than a startup. So that's one of the reasons why startups almost never raise debt early on in their life cycle.
About if you have advice for reaching out to these, especially for teams that are students.
Okay, so the question is, do I have advice for people who want to reach out to VCs, especially if they're students? My advice is wait until the lecture where we're going to talk about that. That's my advice to you. So, cool. We're going to move on. All right, so I want to sketch out for you kind of a high-level overview of the course and where we're going, okay? So these are the 5 very big and very kind of condensed steps to building a startup. Number 1, learn. Learn the culture, learn the products, learn the history of the sector that you're going to build in. Number 2, find great co-founders. It is very important that they're great. If they're not great, it's not going to work. 3, come up with a great idea. It's very important that it's great. If it's not great, it's not going to work. Number 4, validate that your idea is great. It's very important that it's great. If it's not great, it's not going to work. Lastly, raise money for it. Okay, this part we'll talk about later. So step 1, learn. Okay, people very much like to skip the step at their own peril. It's very, very important that if you want to build something, that you spend a lot of time learning about it before you ever try to build anything. Well, I mean, you can build in the process of learning, but you need to learn a lot about what's come before you. So we're going to talk about this a lot in a lecture that's going to come later that I'm going to do called How to Find an Idea or a Good Idea. So the first question, do you know enough to start a startup? In order to ascertain that, you must immerse yourself in the culture, the products, and the history of the thing that you're building in. So if you're trying to build an NFT marketplace, learn about the culture of NFTs, learn about the history of NFT marketplaces, learn about all the products that are out there, use them inside and out, try them out yourself, figure out what works, what doesn't, talk to other customers, build your own mental model of what is actually going on in the space, what's the prior work. Second, join another Web3 startup. This is the best education you can get in a startup, is to join another one, especially one in the same sector, okay? Doesn't have to be for 3 years, you don't have to go get your stripes. Obviously, a lot of your Berkeley students, so Don might get mad at me, but I do recommend if you're going to start a startup, and you don't have to do this now, to join another startup, to build your intuitions, and also potentially to find great co-founders. Because a lot of great co-founders will be hanging out at other startups, and you'll get working experience with them, which is very valuable. Third, read voraciously. Go to meetups and hackathons. Play around with the tech. Be very curious. Try things out. That is how you are going to test your assumptions and learn about different ideas and different things that would not otherwise come to you just sitting alone in your dorm room and reading white papers or whatever. Fourth, if you aren't technical, get technical at least a little bit. Okay, that doesn't mean that you have to go write an AMM or something. Just learn enough to be dangerous, right? Understand what are the limitations of your technical knowledge, and push that technical knowledge a little bit further. If you don't know how to code, maybe learn how to code a little bit. If you know how to code but don't know Solidity, maybe learn a little bit of Solidity, right? If you don't know how a blockchain works, maybe learn a bit how a blockchain works. All these things will be very helpful to you at the margin in being better at solving the underlying problem, even if you are not the technical person on the team or the most technical person on the team. Okay. Step 2, assemble a team. By the way, I'll stop there. Any questions on that part before we get to assembling a team? Any questions? Okay, let's move on. Step 2, assemble a team. The best teams are comprised of friends. So if you don't have any friends here, you're screwed. Or you can make some at the mixer tonight, so you'll be fine. So the number one cause of company failures is co-founder breakups. Co-founder breakups. It's not lack of product market fit. It's not like, some run out of money. It's not any of that stuff. It's that the people who start working together start to hate each other. I'm actually going through with a couple companies right now that are going through co-founder breakups, and it's very messy. It's basically like divorce. It's just, it's horrendous. It's very, very important to pick the right co-founders. Now, what does it mean to pick the right co-founder? How do you know who's the right co-founder, right? Look around you. How would you know if somebody in this room is the right co-founder for you? So the first thing to understand is you don't have to go directly into starting a company with somebody. Okay? A lot of people kind of have this like startup fever where they're like, I don't need to start a startup, like it's part of my life journey. I just know that that's my future. And so they just, you're good enough, let's do this. And it's a terrible idea. Like people don't do that for getting married anymore. They shouldn't do it for startups, okay? Very important that you do not do this for startups. So you can start off small with somebody who you think like, hey, I like this person. I think we might work well together. Let's chew off something smaller. Let's do a small project. Let's do some consulting work. Let's just play around and get a sense of each other's working styles. And ideally do something under pressure. And ideally even do something for money, because nothing brings out emotions like money. And you'll find if you're working with somebody and it's all fun and games, it's like, oh, it's cool, it's fine, whatever. When there's real reputation, there's real money on the line, people's emotions change very dramatically. And I think it's valuable to get an understanding of your co-founders or potential co-founders, how they operate under that kind of stress with you. Everybody is dysfunctional. So what I want to say is that you're not looking for somebody who's perfect, because nobody's perfect except me. What you're looking for is somebody whose dysfunctions work with yours, okay? And I don't think I'm perfect. So generally, you want to pick co-founders who you would trust with your life, who you feel are resourceful and competent, and who complement you, okay? Now, sometimes it's okay to pick 2 co-founders who feel like the exact same person, but most of the time, the best co-founding teams are different. They're different on some axis. Right? It doesn't have to be that, oh, I'm the technical one, you're non-technical. It doesn't have to be that, I'm an Aries, you're a Pisces or whatever. It can be something subtle, but if both of you have the exact same skill set, very often, it can actually cause more fights because each of you feels like you have competence over a domain that the other person feels they have competence in, right? So it's like, wait, I'm the guy who knows about databases. No, I'm the guy who knows about databases. And all of a sudden, you guys are clashing, right? Generally speaking, the best startup teams, they're very good at specializing. They say, look, I'm going to trust you with the database because I trust you because you're competent and you're resourceful. I'm going to trust you even if you make a mistake, which of course you will because this is a startup. I'm going to trust you to be the database person, and I'm going to be the front-end person or whatever. Okay? That kind of separation and that kind of trust is essential to building a great team within a startup. The way that people often describe the way that you'll know that somebody is a great startup co-founder is they describe it as somebody who reminds you of James Bond, or a female version of James Bond. Somebody who just feels like no matter where they are, no matter what they do, they can figure out a way out. They can figure out a way to resolve the mission, to make everything work, to save the hostage or whatever, right? That kind of resourcefulness is the kind of thing that you want to see in a great co-founder. Somebody who you feel like, oh, they're on the job, it's cool, I can rest easy. That's the kind of person you want to find as a co-founder. Now, a very common question is, what about being a solo founder? There are some great solo founders in history. There are not that many. Most solo founders fail, and solo founders fail more than, most founders fail, so that's not saying much. Solo founders fail more than founders that are comprised of teams. Okay, that doesn't mean that it's impossible. There are many solo founders that have been very successful, but more often than not, solo founders tend to come at a significant disadvantage. Now, that being said, you also don't want too large of a team. So generally speaking, like 4 co-founders is pushing it. 5 is almost certainly too many. at 5 co-founders, basically you are, an army of generals, so to speak, right? That doesn't really work. You need some degree of centralization and decision-making and not too much consensus building. Consensus building is slow. Consensus building requires everyone to be bought in, makes it harder to make big decisions, makes it harder to move fast. You have too many people at the table, there's too many people trying to share the credit, too many people who need to all defer to each other in order to get to the right answer. So generally speaking, somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 is usually the right number of co-founders. Most common number is 2, but 3 and 4 usually also are fine. But now, again, that doesn't say that 1 doesn't work, doesn't say 5 doesn't work. If it's 7, it's definitely too many. But most of the time, that's a good rule of thumb for thinking about what tends to produce the most stable teams. The other thing is that when you start a company, almost always you want to decide who's the CEO. Now, that's an uncomfortable decision. And very often, when you're starting a startup with somebody, you want oh, we're going to do this thing, we're going to change the world, it's going to be great. You're not in the mood to start making tough decisions. But this is one of the most important decisions. It's one you should make very quickly when you are potentially deciding to start with somebody together. Because, especially if you have 2 founders, this is the most common situation when you have 2 founders, that when you have 2 founders, one person is going to be the one talking to investors. One person is going to be the one making executive decisions about the company. Now, that doesn't mean that the other person is just not making decisions. Important decisions will be made collectively by the co-founders, right? But one person is the CEO. One person everyone else rolls up to. One person signs the docs. One person makes the final call when the 2 of them are in deadlock. You don't want a situation where you have 2 founders, they're both equal, and each of them can basically deadlock the company and nothing can happen. You don't want that. You want both people, if there's 2, or if there's 3, obviously it's a different situation. You want people coming in knowing how it gets resolved, right? So if you and I are starting a company together and we're getting into a fight, I know in the back of my mind, if we can't get to agreement, you're going to win. It's very important that that is the case in a startup with 2 people. And this is one of the things when you're also thinking about equity splits. So this is a bit farther in the future for you guys, most likely, but if you are going to start a startup, it's important to decide, how do we split the equity? Who gets what? Are we 50-50? Are we 33 down the middle? Does one person get 1 more share than the other person? These are very important questions. Generally speaking, when you have 2 founders, the standard is 50-50. One person gets 1 more share. And that person is the person who breaks the deadlock. That person is the person who ultimately, when you don't agree, this person decides. Now, if you're split 3-way, very often it's somewhat different. Maybe if you're split 3-way, you don't need one person to have more shares than the other 2, because almost certainly there's going to be some way to break the deadlock. You can also give 1 share to an external person, such that that external person can break the deadlock. Could be a trusted third party or friend, advisor, something like that. And another thing is, it's not always the case that teams are 50-50. Sometimes you have a team that it's 70-30, sometimes 75-25, right? That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on the situation, the circumstances, and the negotiation between the people who are coming to the table and what they're bringing. Okay. So we'll talk much more about equity down the road when you're thinking about hiring and building a team and all this other stuff. But for now, these are the important questions when you're at the genesis of thinking about how to build a great team for your startup. So we had a question in the back. So you're asking if you did 49-51, that means you didn't spend enough time thinking about the split? I think I might be misunderstanding the question. Are you saying that if you do a 51-49 split between 2 founders, that VCs will think that you didn't spend enough time setting up the company? Okay, so the question is, does it signal to investors that if you have this 51-49 split, which by the way doesn't need to be that, it can be 50.0001. If you have that split, does that not signal to investors that you didn't spend enough time with your co-founder getting to an agreement about how you're going to resolve conflicts? No, the answer is definitely no. I would never assume anything like that for a startup. That seems like a very strange thing to assume. I think it's much better to have a situation between two founders where they both understand if we get into a fight, what happens, and that one is comfortable deferring to the other. If there's no deference on either side to either the other party or to a third party, that to me spells that they didn't spend enough time thinking seriously about how to build a company together. Another question.
You were seeing setup where you have 51 and 49, and then the next 6 months
have I ever seen a startup where at one point somebody's 51-49, at another point they're 49-51, and they flip it the other way? I have never seen that. I don't know why that would happen. That sounds pretty weird, but no, I've not seen that. So I can't predict what that would imply about the people there. Generally speaking, it's also not that easy. I mean, it's not that hard, but it's not a typical thing you would do is like transferring shares from one founder to another, unless like one of them leaves, right? That's generally the case in which you would remove shares. So just to give you an idea, actually, there's a startup that I'm dealing with right now that they did not do this. They did not have one founder have more equity than the other. And generally speaking, when that happens, so usually it's the case that the founders don't trust each other very much, and that's precisely the case. Is that there's a situation where the founders did not trust each other. There was a breakdown in the relationship, and both founders want to keep running the company and want the other one to leave. And the only way that a situation like that gets resolved, because investors have no power, investors have no ability, unless they have a board seat, to actually influence what happens in a situation like this, unless it's defined in the corporate governance. So usually what that means is that the investors have to come in, or that the totality of everybody who has a stake in the company has to come in and try to resolve it just like interpersonally, right? There's no actual legal right that we have to do anything. The company is literally in deadlock. Nothing can happen unless one of the founders agrees to say, cool, I'm going to walk away. And so you just have to keep working at them until one of them agrees to walk away. Otherwise, nothing happens and the whole company just gets stuck. So that's why it's really bad. Yes, another question. So the question is, how successful can a founding team be if it's literally family, or if it's a partner, boyfriend, girlfriend type relationship, or husband, wife? So with family, I don't know. I have not seen that enough to have a good idea. It's much more common in non-US countries to have startups that are started by families. In the US, it's very rare. I feel like you don't see it a lot. There's one famous example of twin brothers who started a company in crypto called Gemini. Of course, Gemini is a sign for twins. So we know that it does happen, but it's pretty rare. I feel like I don't see it very often in the US. More often it happens through these like kind of dynastic companies, like these conglomerates in Korea or Japan that are run by a family. That's more often they would spin out a company, and those people have very strong connections, and they end up building a successful startup. But it's a little bit different than what we normally think of as a startup, because it's not just like a couple of people, an idea. It's, they have a lot of wealth, a lot of connections, a lot of abilities before that. In terms of partner, I think it really depends. It really depends. You have to underwrite very carefully when you're looking at partners, especially if they are not married. So if they're married, they've been together a very long time, there's normally a sense of more stability there. The difficulty is that, look, if you start a company with somebody, you get pretty tired of interacting with them as work, right? Like you're talking about work all the time. So very often it's nice to be able to go home to your partner and not be in startup mode. And so you don't have that necessarily if the other person that you're with is also in the startup. So that, I think, could be one of the difficulties, that it causes home life and work life to fray a little bit. Some people make it work. And Eventbrite is a famous example of a husband and wife team that ended up building a really impressive company. So it can work, but it's also, I've heard many stories of people who are partners when they started the company and they broke up, and then, they split, and, yes. This kind of thing, unfortunately, when you put relationships under stress, most relationships, like most companies, don't survive, right? You date a number of people before you find the person you're eventually going to be with. So the average, half-life for a relationship is not that long. If you're going to start a company with somebody and you're trying to make it through for like 10 years to get to an exit, is your relationship going to last 10 years, especially under a lot of stress and a lot of hardship? So the answer is sometimes yes, but it depends. Another question in the back. Yeah, so the question is, how on earth do people decide to start a company and not be the CEO? The answer is that if you meet somebody who's good enough, it'll be obvious to you that they should be the CEO. That's the answer. Question.
If like you pick a CEO and then halfway through you other person probably doing more work and more responsible. Like it might not be like bad relationship. You just like figure out that maybe the other guy just does more like
Yeah.
that sort of goes like push things over.
Yeah. So the question is, what if you start a company and you realize that the other guy or the other gal should be the CEO because they're more responsible, they're getting more work done, whatever. So that's not uncommon. That can definitely happen. And if it does, then you just do it and it's not a huge deal. So yeah, but that being said, I want to make clear that being the CEO doesn't mean that you are like the better person or that you work harder or anything like that. Being a CEO is different responsibilities than whatever the other person is doing. And sometimes the person who should be CEO is the person who's not in the weeds working on the product. And that's actually the more valuable thing. So it really depends on the company who should be the CEO. And like, it might seem like, man, talking to investors is really cool because investors have money and that's a big deal. Talking to investors is stupid and annoying and a giant waste of time, right? Talking to investors is not making your company bigger. Talking to investors is just talking to a bunch of rich people and trying to get them to like you, okay? That's what talking to investors is. So the CEO is generally the one talking to investors, which generally means that they're often the person who has fewer brain cells than the person who's building the product, okay? That's okay. That's fine. Sometimes it can mean they're more, they have more social intelligence or whatever, but it doesn't make them a better person. It doesn't mean they get paid more. It doesn't mean they're a bigger deal, right? It has absolutely zero implications about the equity split, about their importance. Sometimes the CEO doesn't even have more equity than the other person. Sometimes the CTO has more equity than the CEO. Right? Doesn't mean that. Those two things don't have to be coupled, but they often are. But that doesn't mean they have to be. So I just want to clarify that CEO is not like you're the better person and this person defers to you on all things. It just means CEO, okay, you're the chief executive officer, the other person is doing something else. And sometimes that's the more important thing, sometimes it's not. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, there is an enormous body of knowledge in crypto, and it seems overwhelming at times. How should one approach this body of knowledge, whether to start a company or to join a company? I don't have a pithy answer for that. I mean, you're kind of asking like the question of crypto is big and hard, what should I do? And I don't know. I don't know what you should do. The answer I'd say is find something that interests you and just start chewing on it. Just like start making progress. And if you try to subsume the whole thing, it's like I asked you, you should learn math because math is really important. You're like, okay, well, math is a giant category of things. I don't even know how to count. I don't know arithmetic. I don't know algebra. I don't know anything. What should I do? Like, just start with what you want to do. It's like, well, I want to count, how many balls are in front of me. Okay, well, counting is a good place to start. And just keep laddering things that you enjoy and that you find interesting. And eventually you'll come across something that has an unsolved problem. That would be my advice. If you try to instead say, look, I'm going to take this 1,000-foot view and say, what did Democritus say about the best way to learn math? You're just going to bore yourself and you're going to give up and you're going to get, exhausted. So don't do that. If you want to build something in space, you're not going to get there out of obligation. You're going to get there because you're actually doing something you want to do. You're actually doing something fun. Because think about startups, and maybe I didn't stress this enough, although I stressed a lot of negative things about them. Startups are very disenchanting. They're very boring. They're very long hours. They're just like, you're just out there grinding and nobody cares. That's most of what building a startup is like. And so the only way that you're going to do that is if you're actually intrinsically motivated to do this underlying thing. Not just, okay, I want to build a great startup. I want to make money. I want to be cool. I want to get written up in TechCrunch, right? The way that you're going to survive building a startup is that you actually enjoy the thing you're doing. You're actually driven to build this product. You actually love NFT marketplace. You actually love, building a DeFi protocol. You actually love building a staking service or whatever it is that you're trying to build, right? You don't actually care about the underlying thing, and you're just like, okay, this thing fits the assignment of I had to build a startup for my Web3 class. You're not, you're just not going to make it. You're just going to give up. Question. You.
Or to actually write the check?
So the question is, would I meet or try to meet every co-founder in the project before I write a check? Generally not. It depends on the startup, depends on the situation, depends on if there are red flags or if there's something I really need to underwrite about a particular person. But if it's a 3-person team, and I'm talking to the founder's technical, they kind of tell me the credentials of the other people on the team, I don't necessarily need to meet them. I might meet them once, but maybe not even once. Other question?
Often you see a couple of CEOs, CTO with CTO has more shares and then they kind of make that. Often the case, or?
So the question is, how often do you see a situation where the CEO, CTO has more shares than CEO? I've seen it sometimes, not common, but I've seen it sometimes. It's not common.
And the reason why we do this?
The reason why they do this is that the CTO is, generally speaking, the person who had the idea, who has the innovation, who's a rock star, who has a great network. And they have this person who's like, look, I want them to run the company because I don't want to deal with any of that shit. I just want to build a great product. And so they bring in a CEO, somebody to trust, great person, presents well to investors, but they don't have most of the equity. So yeah, that's a thing. Yes.
When you invest in ideas and policies, would your decision be more founder-centric or idea-centric?
That's a great question. So the question is, if I'm investing in a startup, is my investing criteria more founder-centric or more idea-centric? So this is a very particular thing that depends on the individual investor. There are some investors who are very product-driven. They love great products, and they want to see that you've built something really amazing that they can get their arms around. There are some investors that are very team-driven. They just bet on a great team. They say, look, the team is going to figure out the product. There are other investors who are very market-driven. They say, look, I want to bet on a particular market that I'm excited about. I think DeFi is going to grow. I want to bet on DeFi founders. I think NFTs are going to grow. I want to bet on NFT projects, right? And they kind of backport the founders and the particular ideas, the particular products into their market thesis, right? For myself personally, I'm much more, I would say, market and team-driven in the early stages. And later on, I become more product-driven. That's kind of the way that I fit, but different investors think about it differently and have different biases in the way that they underwrite investments. Cool. Online questions.
It's
a great question. So the question is, given the shift to remote work, how do you see the advantages or disadvantages to having a remote team when it comes to starting a startup? So this is a very complicated question. The answer is that we don't really know yet. We don't actually have very good data on any of this. So like anybody who's telling you that they have an idea is just kind of guessing. We basically had 2 years where everything was basically being built remotely. And where now people are kind of starting to go back to in person a little bit, but not that much. So the honest answer is that we don't know. I think a lot of people are trying to prognosticate. They're trying to say, well, I can tell you because blah, blah, blah. I just know in my heart of hearts that people in person are better, people remote are just as fine. I think the answer is that we don't know. In order to know, we would have to see an extended period of time where you had non-self-selected startups that were being built out in regular space and being built out remotely. It's very clear that in crypto is abnormally well-suited to remote work because of the fact that everything lives online. Everybody lives in Discord, everybody lives on Twitter. All this stuff is happening open source. It's mostly software, right? So there's very little stuff that would naturally demand in-person collaboration. Software, I think, tends to be the easiest to build remotely, whereas building hardware is not as easy to build remotely. Like you generally need to be in person. If you're building robots, how are you gonna do that remotely? But I think of everything you could imagine, I think crypto is probably the best suited to starting companies remotely. The big issue I think with remote founding is that very often it's very hard to build a lot of trust with your co-founders if you only know them online. Because if you only know them online, you just haven't seen them in that many environments, right? You've only seen them when they're online talking to you. And that's a time when they're in the mood to be online and talking to you. But when you're working with somebody in a startup, you are seeing them in every possible permutation of their emotional states. And it's just very hard to get that very often from, a Telegram or a Discord buddy. So that being said, it can be done. And there are a lot of people who have worked together. And that's the thing that I look for the most is that you and your co-founders have worked together on something. So that you've been able to see them in different working environments and have built at least some baseline of trust in their working abilities. So the question is, are there examples of solo founders who are able to make it big in the crypto space? There are many. So let's see, who's a good example of a solo founder? So Robert Leshner, founder of Compound, solo founder. There is Star, the founder of OKX, solo founder, one of the largest exchanges in the world. The founder of Andre Cronje, who's a very famous DeFi founder. He's a solo founder. Hayden Adams from Uniswap, the founder of Uniswap, he's a solo founder. There are a lot of them. So I don't think it's I don't think one can say very easily that it requires, by any means, that you require multiple co-founders in order to succeed in crypto. And of course, Satoshi was probably #1 solo founder. Presumably, could have been a group of people. All right, we have to move on. We have 30 minutes, right? Sorry? Okay. I'll try to move things along. So I'm gonna stop on questions here and keep barreling forward. So all right, just to remind you what we were talking about. We're talking about the steps to building a startup. Step 1 was learn about stuff. Step 2 is assemble a team. Step 3 is come up with a great idea. Step 4 is validate that the idea is actually great. We'll talk a lot about this later when we talk about how to pick a great idea and how to validate it. Step 5 is to raise money. We'll also talk a lot more about raising money later. Don't worry, I'm a VC, so you'll be in good hands. We also have a number of other VCs who'll be touching on this. So I wanted to also very briefly breeze through a brief history of crypto, because I know many of you are conversant and familiar with crypto, but for a lot of you, you've probably shown up to crypto within the last year or two. And you're like, oh, crypto is about NFTs. That's so exciting. But there's a lot more that's gone on in crypto before the advent of NFTs. And I want to motivate a little bit of this course and kind of, next lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the big areas of innovation for the next 3 lectures. So we're going to talk about layer 1s, layer 2s, DeFi, infrastructure. Then we'll talk about NFTs in the metaverse and gaming. Then we'll talk about DAOs and some future applications of crypto. But I want to start by giving you again the big picture of what's gone on up till now in crypto land. Okay, so brief history. Until 2009, the internet did not have a purely digital form of money. Okay, so in the early internet, if you wanted to send money to somebody online, you had to do it using a bank, a regular old bank. Most of these banks weren't even online at that time, right? So you just have to go to your normal bank and tell your normal bank, hey, I want to send a normal transfer of normal money to a normal person, right? That's how people paid each other on the internet. There was no way to send money as bits. No way to send money through the internet. We learned how to do voice over IP, so you could send phone calls to the internet. We learned how to do text messaging, so you could send text to the internet. We learned how to send almost everything to the internet, except for money. We still sent money the old way. Then came a big breakthrough by this guy presumably named Satoshi Nakamoto, who we know is a pseudonym. We don't know who Satoshi Nakamoto really was, although people project they have some theories about who Satoshi might have been. But Satoshi published a white paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, in which Satoshi described a new way to create a decentralized blockchain that could allow you to create a native form of money on the internet. He solved this problem of creating an internet native form of money with the invention of Bitcoin. For the first time, the internet had its own form of money. Bitcoin is completely native to the internet. It is not controlled by any bank, not controlled by any individual, not controlled by any government. It is basically the money of the internet. The first time this ever happened. Now, once you make money digital, the thing about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is very limited in what it can do. Okay, so Bitcoin was invented in like 2008, 2009. It's very antiquated, right? Bitcoin has this very simplistic scripting language, but it can't do very much. So most of what you can do with Bitcoin is I can send you Bitcoin, you can send me Bitcoin, and that's about it. Okay. But immediately once Bitcoin started working, people had ideas about, okay, well, you can send people money, but what else can you do, right? There's a lot of other cool things you could do. And so you started coming up with a bunch of people creating this thing called altcoins. Altcoins, short for alternative coins, were these coins that took Bitcoin and extended it a little bit. They like added just a little flyer, a little extra feature, a little this, a little that, right? So there's things like Blackcoin, Litecoin, Namecoin, Petercoin, Feathercoin. They oftentimes would add just a little opcode into the scripting language of Bitcoin, so they can now do this thing. So now we can add an exchange into Bitcoin, or we can take Bitcoin and we can change the proof of work and make it a little bit different, or we can make it a little bit bigger, we can make it a little bit faster, a little bit smaller, or whatever, right? A lot of people added these little permutations to Bitcoin. But there's a big looming question of what else can you do? It feels like this idea of building a decentralized ledger that people can record transactions on, we can do more with that than just Bitcoin. And so the idea came along of what if you could make contracts digital? What if you could make it so property can be governed by code? There was this little 19-year-old kid named Vitalik Buterin who came along and had this idea. What if we took Bitcoin and we just added a fully Turing-complete scripting language to it, meaning that you could write any piece of code and it would run on Bitcoin. And there was a coin at the time called Mastercoin that he was proposing this to. The Mastercoin was like trying to add all this stuff to Bitcoin. It was like the coolest thing at the time was Mastercoin. And so Vitalik went up to Mastercoin and he said, Mastercoin, you guys should add a general purpose scripting language. And they were like, no, you stupid kid, you can't do that. It's going to break everything. It's going to cause, all these DDoS attacks. It's not going to work. It's not sustainable. This is a known unsolvable problem. And Vitalik said, all right, screw you guys. I'm going to go build it myself. And so he started what is now called Ethereum. And Ethereum opened the door to smart contracts. Okay? Ethereum was started, basically the blockchain began in 2015. It's been operating now for about 7 years. Now, what is a smart contract? A smart contract is a piece of code that runs on the blockchain and is completely autonomous, meaning that it doesn't require anybody in particular to make the contract run. Okay, the contract can be quote unquote self-enforcing. Now, when we say contract, it's kind of a metaphor. It's not literally a contract, it's just a piece of code. But that's kind of what a contract is, right? A contract is an agreement that something will happen if some conditions happen, right? So sort of if blah, 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 then blah, blah, blah. That's what a contract is. Well, code can do that just as well. So I want to motivate the understanding of like why smart contracts are such a big deal. And in fact, they make possible most of the innovations that we're seeing now within crypto and that we're going to talk about over the upcoming weeks of the course. So in a traditional contract, right, before the advent of Ethereum, if let's say you and I have an employment agreement, right? So I'm hiring you and I'm paying you some amount of money, okay? What actually enforces that agreement? Well, we write it down on a piece of paper, right? We get some lawyers to look at it. We pay those lawyers a lot of money, and they sign this, piece of paper, and they say this is law, this is legal, this is a binding contract, right? Okay, well, but it's in reality it's just a piece of paper, right? I can go throw it against the wall, I can go throw it in the trash. What's a piece of paper going to do? Pieces of paper are not magic; they can't do anything. Okay. Well, if I don't do what's in the piece of paper, what happens? Audience participation. What happens if I don't do what's in the piece of paper? I get sued, right? Well, another piece of paper will show up in the mail, say, I am suing you. Okay, well, that's also a piece of paper. I can throw that away too. What happens if I ignore the piece of paper that you sent after the other piece of paper? So yeah, so somebody will go to court. They will say that I'm suing you. You have to show up in court. I will get a court summons. If I don't show up to the court summons, then I'll be said I'm in contempt of court, and I'll get another piece of paper that says I'm in contempt of court. Now, what happens if I ignore that piece of paper? Eventually, if I ignore enough pieces of paper, men with guns will come to my house, right? That is how you enforce contracts in the normal world. If you don't have the men with guns coming to your house, they don't work. Contracts are enforced through the state, through the entire apparatus that we have of courts and lawyers and policemen and constables and blah, 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 all that stuff. It's all there so that you and I will do what we say on a piece of paper. And the idea of Ethereum is that we don't need all that shit. We don't need courts. We don't need police. We don't need constables. We don't need pieces of paper. Okay. If we write our agreement into code on a smart contract, then we know that it will be fulfilled. It will be fulfilled automatically. That is the promise of a smart contract. It obviates the need for a lot of the architecture that we use today to enforce agreements. So you can think of Ethereum, and Tim Roughgarden gave this a great analogy. You can think of Ethereum as a computer in the sky. It's a big computer that we can all get time on, and we can tell that computer to enforce certain agreements between us, and the computer will always do it. We can do computations on the computer, we can write state in the computer, we can read state from the computer, we can do whatever we want with that computer. It might be costly because it's it's not that big of a computer and there's a lot of us, but technically we can do anything we can do with a computer with this big computer in the sky. So software can encode almost anything. You can encode an NFT, you can encode a tweet, you can encode a loan, you can encode an in-game item. And we'll talk about all these things as categories of innovations that are enabled by smart contracts. But this is the kernel of why blockchains have become so powerful and so innovative. And it's a lot of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the course. The last thing I want to say, and then we're going to wrap up, like many technologies before it, what smart contracts enable, which is so important, is permissionless innovation. Okay, what is permissionless innovation? Permissionless innovation is the idea that if you want to build something new, if you want to make something new, you don't have to ask anybody for permission. You can just do it. Okay, these are the core of why some of the biggest innovations of the world have changed the face of human invention. Right? You look at the printing press. Printing press allowed anyone to write anything. Where normally you needed to have access to a library, to scribes, to people who had very restricted access to be able to write things down. A computer allowed anybody to write software from anybody in the world. The iPhone allowed anybody to make an application that could run on anyone's phone, right? All these things were complete shifts in not just the access, but the nature of permission for interacting with these technologies, right? Before, if you wanted to put something like this, so this is a course, we're live streaming, right? If you wanted to broadcast something like this, you need to get permission from basically the FCC. If you want to put something on TV, you have to get approval. You can't just, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you couldn't just go and decide, hey, I'm going to put this thing on TV, right? You have to get permission to put things on TV. There are all these rules, all these censors, all these committees that decided what could go on TV and what couldn't. And that made it not only slow and laborious, not only meant that not anything could go on TV, but also meant that it was expensive to put things on TV because you had to go and get, fill the whole checklist. But now you can just live stream whatever the hell you want. That completely changes the culture of innovation around media. It also changes the cost structure around media. Now it's impossible for a poor little university like Berkeley to be able to live stream anything they want because of the fact that now media is permissionless. Anybody can create any media they want. The same thing is now happening with smart contracts. Smart contracts is enabling a whole new category of companies and innovations that previously required you to get permission and to pay a lot of money to innovate very cheaply, very quickly, without anybody having to agree that your idea is a good one. So that was a lot. I'm going to stop there because I know that Don is giving me eyes that I'm long. Any last question or no time for questions? Okay. Oh, so we're back to the earlier slides. I can do that. I can do that. Cool. So any questions before we wrap up the inaugural lecture? Yes. The question is, would we be more likely to invest in a group of founders who have graduate degrees? No, but it depends on what they're building. If what they're building is something that requires a graduate degree, then probably yes. But a graduate degree in and of itself doesn't signal anything other than that you went to graduate school. I mean, it doesn't, if what you're asking is like, well, are people who go to graduate school smarter or better at companies or something? No, the answer is no, definitely not. The question is, what if it was building on the research? Then, okay, it sounds very relevant to what they're building, in which case, okay, yes, but not because they went to graduate school. It's because they have the relevant skills to the thing they're building. That's why I would invest. I don't give a shit what school you did or didn't go to. Okay, Don, take it away.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining the first lecture of this class. Before we end, we'll just summarize with a few additional points. So first, right, so this is the first orientation intro class. And for the rest of the semester, we lay down essentially a broad spectrum of different topics. In the beginning, the next 3 lectures, as we mentioned, we're actually going to give overall landscape for students here to learn about Web3 and crypto. So here actually it's quite interesting. So with Hasib, we actually discussed quite a bit on some of these topics. So essentially, if you go to a VC today in Web3 and crypto, talking about what are the broad strokes of different topics, essentially these are all listed here, including L1, L2 infrastructure, DeFi, CeFi service providers. Due to the limit of class, we actually have to merge some of these topics into one lecture. And then the second one is on NFTs, GameFi, and the third one is on DAOs, and also a catch-all for others, essentially decentralized web and future applications. So these help you to set the foundation to understand better about the overall landscape of Web3, and helps you to figure out more what particular area that you want to explore more for your class project and so on. And then the rest of the semester essentially helps you to gain more skills and insights for what you need to build a startup. For example, how to find a good idea, how to do pitching. And as I mentioned, we'll be doing a pitching workshop. And also product is really important. Right, so essentially learning how to do how to define products and find product market fit, and then incentive design and tokenomics. And then for Web3 and crypto, as I mentioned, it's subversive. So actually, there's a lot of questions on legal and regulatory side. So that's a very important topic that we want to cover. And then community and growth. and then in the end, final project and presentation. And again, the class has been put together with actually a lot of careful thoughts in terms of the speakers for these different topics. They are all essentially, thought leaders and people really with great experience and leaders in relevant space. So you will also see that these are essentially speakers that we carefully selected to really can give you a very good coverage on the topic. And also besides the amazing guest speakers that we put together, also we are really grateful for a number of mentors who have been joining the class as well to help mentor students for your class projects. And again, these mentors are great VCs with a lot of experience in the space as well. And it's great that they actually can help contribute time to help mentor students here as well. So with that, as I mentioned, we have the RDI for welcome reception. And also, as I mentioned, we set up like 4 small about tall tables for students to make it easier for students to find each other of similar topics. So you can form groups for your class projects. And then these are the 4 tables. Essentially, each table covers a subset of the topics in Web3 and crypto. And you can see which topics that you are interested in, and then you can go to the table to help you find other potential group partners. And of course, if you are interested in multiple topics, you can roam around the tables as well. So with that, any other questions for the C or the class? And are there any other questions on as well?
Are we going to learn in marketing?
You will, it's in the community and growth section, we'll be talking about marketing. Growth is kind of connected to marketing, but yeah, we will.
Any other questions? Then with that, let's thank Haseeb for a good intro and Entrepreneurship 101. And now please join the reception and also find your table to find your potential group partners. Thank you.